Hi, my name is Karen Holmes. I'm the founder and director of the World Peace Organization for the One World Government. For the last several videos, I've talked about paradigm shift. And we're watching a paradigm shift occur now in our thinking, starting to represent this idea. Donald Trump, in the last, because the book Peril has come out by Woodward and Costa, they report that Donald Trump has accused General Milley of treason because he communicated with his counterparts in China. So the people who are in power related to the military and the U.S. government are saying, no, that happens all the time. That's not something to worry about. That's not treason. He's doing his job. Okay, so let's think about what people's jobs are. The President of the United States is supposed to represent all Americans, not just the Trump supporters or just members of the party or people who support him or vote for him. He's supposed to represent everyone. And usually our election process allows us to shake out, that the person who gets the most votes is the person who represents will represent the interests of everyone. But even after somebody from another party is elected to that office, we kind of think of that person as being our president. And when they say this person is not our president, that's pretty drastic. That's pretty extreme from the perspective of the average American. That person doesn't represent the interests of our interests. So what is that happening? Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is I'm not making a judgment on anybody, because on the opposite side of the spectrum, where each of us is an individual and we function for our own interests, and a president has to get reelected and has to function on all these different levels. But usually our election process is designed to get us to America to the point, or any country to the point where that person represents everybody. When General Milley made his statement, he was working with the Chinese. What he was doing was he was on a bridge between defending the country, but also defending his people, his own people in the military. We don't want to start a war and put somebody into our troops into battle where they're going to lose their lives. Now, that is it's the kind of thing where he's looking at, the generals are supposed to look at representing the military let's say they're all sitting around and the crisis has occurred, sitting around the Situation Room, and the president is looking at this, and he should be getting insights from all the different people who are involved in his cabinet. How is this going to affect the economy? How is this going to affect our infrastructure? How will this affect our military? How will this affect the State Department? And everybody is supposed to, when it's running right, it's supposed to all represent their individual parts. Now, this is pretty obvious. Now, what I wanted to do is talk about this paradigm shift a little bit, and then also talk about it related to Stonehenge. Okay, because that's one of our things is a character defamation campaign against Iraq, bringing it back to that idea. I know I keep doing it, but this is something that is an existential threat for the world. This is the global genocide that's been devolving, that started as a result of one individual, one president who was functioning basically based on power games. power games. He said, after all, this guy tried to kill my dad. Saddam Hussein tried to kill my dad. So I am going to take the full power of the United States and I'm going to direct it at that guy who tried to kill my dad. Okay, you see what we're talking about. If Donald Trump is saying, this guy is treason, is he trying to defend the country, or is he trying to say, this guy didn't do what I told him to do, and therefore I want him to be fired? Okay, so we're looking at this big, broad spectrum of the power games that are being played, and the military is, like I said in the past, the Pentagon is shaped like a pentagon because it's based on the 5 power games that lead to war, genocide, massacres, terrorism, and basically slavery and human rights violations that lead to like ISIS, organizations like ISIS. Okay, so we're looking at a transition out of war-based thinking based on the idea of an individual playing a power game that is going to drag everybody else into the crisis. So what happened at Stonehenge? So let's say that we have a place where there are lots of small, and in that time period they had small holdings, and then like a chieftain had like a family clan kind of thing, and they would have a certain amount of people that were their warriors, and then they had the families and the farmers and the people who did different crafts and things like that. So the warriors were the people. These were just people who would rise up to defend their place. When you dragged, and this was one of the problems that we had during our American Revolution, is that with the militia concept, you had one person who was in charge of this militia, and that person was, they would have to take like the oldest son of a farmer or whatever, and then they would go off to war. So anytime the farmers got dragged into a conflict with their pitchforks and whatever pikes or whatever they had, staffs or pikes or whatever, then what they had was no way to basically maintain the food supply. So that's, like I said, how is this going to affect the supply chain? They have to think about all those things. But when you have one individual who's saying, acting out of ego and pride leads to war, basically acting out of pride, I have to stand up and defend myself, otherwise I don't have any power anymore. It's a power game. So those days, if one person is acting out of pride, then what they would do is they would say, no, we can't decimate. If we have to do that, we have to have somebody who is standing there saying, if you act out of pride, we will decimate our people. Now, if you had, let's say in England, on that island, if you had, let's say 100 chieftains, and they would go to war with another person, with another king, rile them up or that kind of thing and go to war because they felt that they could, then they would try to expand their power using that. The last battle at Stonehenge was actually an act of character defamation because what happened, and we'll go into that deeper in other times, having to do with, it was a genocide rather than, and the knee-jerk reaction that ends a war based on pride makes a genocide worse, and that's what happened. It was the hostile takeover. We are now looking at the idea of, let's say, Donald Trump and how he had his relationship with Vladimir Putin, that he had been still working on the idea of a Trump hotel in Moscow, as the election was getting close, he was still communicating with him, thinking if he didn't win, he still wanted to do that. So we're dealing with like a hostile takeover situation. We're back in the same situation that happened then. So when George W. Bush did the preemptive strike, saying, after all, this guy tried to kill my dad, and then called him this axis of evil, judged him to be evil, that's when everything started to turn into a genocide rather than a war. It was a character defamation campaign, and no one has the right to say somebody else is evil. All right, so the character defamation campaign is taking it to the next level down. But when we're talking about General Milley and this transitioning people out of war-based thinking, what he did then was he made people stop to think that if you have a general who's backing you up, if you're like a little guy and you have a big brother who's going to kind of like come and back you up, what happens if the big brother is basically saying, you need to stop and think about what you're doing? You know, this is going to be I can't beat up your enemies for you. I can't risk all the people that are behind me that I'm responsible for. He bridges between the military and the government. So war-based thinking, when you had all those different kings, was based on the idea, they were thinking the chieftain, his person next to him, his lieutenant, so to speak, was also warning him that when you do this, this is going to cause problems. You are going to cut down. It's going to cost us something. It's going to cost. War is expensive. It's going to cost people thinking. So they had to come up with a different idea for transitioning out of war-based thinking. And over the years, England came up with some pretty interesting ideas about that. What they did was they came up with tournaments. They came up with the idea that if you take the knights, but how did they get knights when it went from that? That was something that I believe Joan of Arc had to do with in that time period. But they were transitioning out of that time period, out of the knights. They would have their people, the Knights of the Round Table. But then that transitioned out of it when those knights were ransomed. They could be ransomed. The farmers were with their pitchforks, so they were being killed, and their farms were being run then by their wives and their little kids, and putting them basically out of business and maybe starving over the winter, and couldn't maintain. It's expensive. So, but at that point, when the knights gentlemen were being ransomed, they could go right off. They had the armor, they had everything, and then they get knocked off their horse and caught. Then they would be ransomed. So, but the farmers were never ransomed. They were just killed, and it cost them. So eventually what happened is the farmers just got smart, and then they just did away with that. That's when standing armies came about. So let's consider how when they did that, when they had the knights, then they started to transition out of it by doing tournaments. And then they would decide it. And that's what happened at Stonehenge. They had started to transition out of that by having knights. They had the archers on the henge part, the raised area, and they had the two armies there, the chieftains, the clans, the warriors, so to speak. And they had the same size about, and then they would go there. And then if they got out of hand, then the archers would shoot them from their position. They weren't allowed to bring weapons in. That kind of made it a little bit more difficult. Then to wage a war, to do something subversive, if the warriors with their longbows, the Welsh with their longbows, the Robin Hood or William Tell idea where he shooting the arrow through the apple on his head. So there we have a transition out of it. They started to come out of it because, first of all, it was too expensive to do that. Then Stonehenge was actually a situation where if there was a dispute, they would go and do that. Now we are at another stage where we're starting to transition out of war-based thinking because the plan for world peace that treats everybody fairly and equally, and we're getting rid of power games now, and we're coming up with a way to actually do what's in everyone's best interest, where people are functioning based on projects as a grassroots movement. Everybody's starting to function on a global basis now. The economies will be based more on peace-based thinking, win-win agreements for economic win-win. We don't go to war over natural resources. It'll be based more on win-win agreements and natural resources and people on their talents and gifts and making win-win agreements. That's the principles of the flower of life pattern. So I see what General Milley did made people think a little bit differently about this. You think of one president and one president, leader, dictator, whatever, getting into a battle, and how do you defend yourself when they're playing power games, when they're functioning? And when George W. Bush said, after all, that guy tried to kill my dad, that was a personal thing. It became like a vendetta, part of the pentacle of power. So as we transition out of that now, we're starting to make that idea where the games don't work anymore, and we cannot get our life by playing games. That when we have nuclear weapons and we have Russia, for example, infiltrating to the United States, cybersecurity issues where our businesses can be that are all on the internet and on the cloud. What happens if the cloud is no longer available to us? What happens if they have nesting dolls technology where they have a satellite killer? It comes in and then comes out and then goes and kills the satellites up there. So what if you have a satellite situation for cybersecurity, the cloud, whatever, and it's down? How are you going to solve the problem? So one of the things we are doing on the organization is we're coming up with a new form of technology, a new form of internet that makes it harder for that to happen. We're also coming up with other ideas that are like besides the plan for world peace and Oxford and Stonehenge, and working with the idea of the cursus, which will be like the military Olympics instead of, to help make that transition. The third dimension is based on illusion, that you can get your life by playing power games, and eventually what happens is when the games stop working, then you go down. That's where the world is now. The games don't work anymore. Now what we have to do is reach the point. We've reached the point where people are saying enough is enough. If the President of the United States is accusing his top general of treason, then enough is enough. The games are over. And then now we have to start building our way out, climbing our way out of the abyss. And that is when we start to function based on the principles of universal law. So when I introduce a plan for the letter to the Supreme Court, that's when we're talking about unalienable rights, that nobody really has the right to wage war on anyone anymore. The games don't work. What will work is making win-win agreements based on the principles of cooperation of nature, and standing on making win-win agreements. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We're looking at more of a globalization idea, but more like doing what's in everyone's best interest, and it isn't necessarily globalization. If you're a parent, don't you have to do what's in everyone's best interest? Don't you have to consider things? Everybody, if you are a teacher, don't you have to consider everybody and not consider one person to be more important than another? Don't you have to consider, if you're a university, don't you have to consider everything? How about president and so on? You have to look at everything and then function, let go of the games that are so oppressive to other people, and go on from that point. So that's all I wanted to say today. I ask that you like, share, and subscribe. We're going to be looking at all this with our exit strategy for rock proposal, going through and ending the global genocide that's going about. And that came about, it started out with George Bush saying, after all, that guy tried to kill my dad. And then what we're doing is we're going to unravel, we're going to introduce a protocol for ending genocides when people say enough is enough and stop, stop, stop. So isn't that kind of what General Milley did? Stop, stop, stop. We're going to not let anything happen here. Nothing's going to happen. We're not going to do anything. You'll know if there's a real problem. We'll let you know. We don't want a war. Nobody wants a war. Wars cost too much. Okay, so like, share, and subscribe. Think about how people are making this transition period where the games don't work anymore, and then what does work up here. This is third dimensional thinking. What does work is when you say, I can get my life, but I can't get it by playing the games. Okay, that's fourth dimensional thinking. That's the paradigm shift. I'm getting my life by playing the games. Third dimensional, fourth dimensional thinking is, I can get my life, but I can't get it by playing the games. Kind of bouncing back and forth between the two. The people who function only for their own interests, and they can get trapped right at that point, like a bipolar thing. And that is the people who, like a sociopath who says, let's say, who says, I can get my life by playing the games. It's like a backwards twist to it. So we have to work on that idea too. Okay, so that's all. Like, share, and subscribe, but most of all, share. Join the debate and talk about this paradigm shift and transitioning out of war-based thinking into peace-based thinking, and how it's been actually happening for a long time. It's been happening since 5,000 years ago, when Stonehenge was created, and people would say, okay, we're not going to wage war. We're going to take our dispute between these two guys to Stonehenge, and we're going to treat you like kings. You're kings, but we're going to treat you really well, and then we're going to just transition out of it. We're going to turn it over to them and let them figure out how to stop this dispute. Benefits everyone. Sometimes if people are playing a power game, you just need to, and they have an ego and they're playing the game of pride, we're going to take you to Stonehenge and treat you really, really well. Think of it as like taking them to the spa or something like that. A fancy resort. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for stopping by.